Welcome back to another episode of Perligo Ponders, in which I respond to your comments, questions, and theories about my own comments, questions, and theories related to the lore and music of the band 21pilots. As always, if you would like your comment or question to be featured in next month's episode, just simply comment something below. I'm also doing these more frequently than just once a month nowadays, so if you would like it to be featured, it may be sooner than just a month. Our first comment comes from Sofilsalva, I believe is how it's pronounced, who writes, "Weird theory, but it feels like Trench to Breach was the backstory to Blurryface, if it's only based on markings. Nego got over the nose, Clancy got over his mouth, but Tyler, the Blurryface era, only had it up to his neck. And I can't remember if it's right, but the marks began to fade towards the end of the Emotional Roadshow. That's the Clancy that broke the cycle." Yes, I know that about the marks representing his insecurities, but I'm just throwing this in the wind. This is an interesting idea. Certainly, I think I've seen some other comments as well talk about this idea, that Breach might be the backstory to Blurryface. And I think there's a sense in which it is undeniably true because it is a cycle that's repeating again. And so if the next Clancy is going to go through the cycle again, then that would presumably be starting with Blurryface. Right. So even just on this kind of surface level, explicit narrative of the lore that we've been given, we were told in its intentions, that he was starting all over again. So that means he'd be starting what started with Blurryface all over again, which would make everything that came before, including Blurryface in a sense, and that's where it gets a little interesting, but including Breach, and make that a backstory to Blurryface. In terms of the markings, and this is something else that people have been talking about, and I think it's interesting, but I don't actually know how much weight can be given to the markings in and of themselves. But this idea that over time the markings go from basically here to just on his neck, and so on down. And so as a result, each time it gets lower, he's winning a bit more and a bit more. The main pushback I would have to that in terms of saying, well, because of that, the next iteration being Blurryface with the markings just on his neck means he's progressed farther, is that Clancy had the markings on his neck before he became a bishop. So even if that meant he had progressed farther in terms of it was lower now, when he became a bishop, it then went higher again. So I don't know how much you can actually say he progressed farther if he still backslid into that again. I do think it's an interesting idea, though. I also think it's fair to look at everything from Blurryface onwards in a different light. And I think more specifically what you're saying here is that Breach, or Trench to Breach, was the backstory to Blurryface. Again, if it's a cycle, yes, everything is a backstory. But I can kind of see that in a sense. I think the other second thing that I would say to push back is that if Trench to Breach is a cycle, then how come in Clancy and the I'm Clancy video, he describes Nico as being called Blurryface, if that's the future bishop? So an interesting idea. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a ton of weight to some of this, but it's also there's a non-zero possibility, and there's also just the fact that being a cycle and him becoming a bishop at the end of the cycle means we have to look at all of this through a slightly different lens than we used to in a lot of ways. Next up, we have a comment from the Perligo. Perligo ponders, do you believe the reasoning why the Live Clancy Tour album has not released is because they will record a Breach Tour show to add to it? Since this is basically Clancy Tour like 2. Enjoy the content, keep it up. Yes, that is very much my working theory right now as to why we have not seen that live album released. Maybe they won't record it or record any of the shows. If they don't, then the other alternative, which I think is also very likely, is that they didn't want to conflict with Breach. And this gives them something that they can release next year for 2026 Record Store Day, something like that. Something they can rule out as the band's on a break, at the very least. But certainly I think it would be cool to include stuff from the Breach Tour as well, and that would make a lot of sense if they can get it recorded. I don't know why they couldn't get it recorded, because they film, they have cameras running all the time and stuff at the shows, but there's probably more that goes into recording a show for the quality that you want to be pressed on a vinyl than just that. The next comment here. This comes from Jack Blonda, who is often featured in these episodes. He has some good insights quite often. Perligo ponders question. I love the ending. Obviously knew Clancy would turn out this way, but the music video was well done. Agreed. My only thought is what happened to the city of Dema on fire from the Clancy digital remains felt like the fire would have been a bigger deal and a solution to the problem of Dema. I think we are all, to one degree or another, wondering this same thing. What happened to the fire? What happened to the fire in the outside? What happened to the fire in the digital remains? What happened to those images of Dema on fire and Clancy kind of seeming to lie down on the ground in the glow of the fire and the flames? What was that all about? One possible interpretation is that it's showing us a glimpse of what happens after he breaks the cycle and after the ending of Dragpath takes place. Dragpath exists really just in the context of the digital remains. The lyrics were in the Clancy edition, and the song was in the Breach edition. And in that, we also saw the images of Dema being destroyed. So one way to understand that is the digital remains chapter, as it were, of the story. Combining Clancy and Breach is what happens in Dragpath at the end of Dragpath. That final version, the one who is found by the Torchbearer, presumably, and who then defeats himself because of that, burns Dema to the ground and destroys it. But again, that's something that, in a sense, he's just envisioning. Those images almost look like drawings, paintings of Dema on fire rather than photographs. And so it's something that Clancy, or all the Clancys as they keep going through the cycle, envision happening, envision being able to destroy Dema, burn it to the ground, but each one isn't quite able to achieve it. And so it's a vision, just like Dragpath is a vision of the future, of this future hope that he has that hasn't quite been achieved or accomplished yet. He was dreaming. Yeah, so I mean, that's sort of essentially what I was saying, or another variation on what I was saying. Yeah, it's kind of a dream, a vision, a hope that he has for something that he'll be able to accomplish, but hasn't yet. Again, there's that blue fire in the outside. A little confusing. There's some other things like the city of Dema looking kind of different every time we see it. Is that intentional? Is that just sort of continuity error on the creative part? Something to keep considering. So good question. That's my short answer, but something that I think, again, we got this ending, story's over, the implications are many and deserve to be unpacked in their own right. All right, DJ Cody has this to say. Perligo ponders, my thought is that Vessel, specifically Truce, was the ending of the last cycle, which included all of Self-Titled, Regional at Best, and Vessel, ending with Truce. I also noticed how the black paint on Clancy's face is lower. This is a similar idea to what we were just saying and what Jackie Morrison was talking about. It's lower than that of Nico's. So I'm thinking that every cycle the paint gets lower, and it will finally disappear when the cycle is broken. But those are my thoughts. What do you think? So we already discussed the black paint thing. But just on the idea of Vessel and Truce being the ending of a previous cycle, I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. Sort of starting with implicit demand for proof and ending with Truce. And then a new cycle begins with Heavydirtysoul and ends with Intentions. Certainly there are parallels you can draw, of course, between Truce and Intentions, but also between Heavydirtysoul and implicit demand for proof. One is a sort of demand, and the other is more of a plea. But it's also implicit demand for proof, you could kind of say, is a plea in a sense as well. One is calling for destruction, the other is calling for salvation, right? But again, you can kind of see those parallels between those songs. It's not a terrible idea. My interpretation of those early albums, as I've talked about in the past, is basically that Self-Titled is the spark notes, essentially, of the story. Regional at Best has elements that tie into it, but isn't really a chapter in the story so much as like a collection of elements that we then see reappearing later. And Vessel is kind of the prologue to the story that begins with Blurryface. Vessel almost you could see as a dream, a sort of a dream, a blurry poetic dream before launching into the bulk of the story. So if you imagine it as a movie, you could imagine the movie opening with Vessel, opening with that dream that is found within Vessel. And then, the opening credits roll and you get Blurryface to Breach. the end credits roll with intentions. That doesn't mean this is necessarily wrong. I don't think we can say for sure, and it certainly is an interesting way to look at it. I think all the cycles are contained from a sort of blurry face to breach saga. We have a question from Murdoch. I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something just doesn't feel cohesive, but I haven't been able to put my finger on it until yesterday. Heavydirtysoul to me has never felt quite connected to the rest of the lore videos. This is an interesting idea. The cinematography and the way they are dressed, I don't know exactly, it just feels like it's in a different universe. This could be chalked up to budget back in Blurry Face or not having the whole vision quite fleshed out, but I think there's more to it than that. You mentioned controlled dream, or dreams, or dreaming. I think we might be seeing a near-death experience. He was in the car crash. Something else that's always nagged at me is the Heathens video. It's supposedly not lore related, but he has the nose scar that Clancy has throughout the subsequent videos, or at least some of them. So my working theory is that he's on the brink of death after the car crash, and Heathens is some kind of purgatory between worlds, and everything after is an allegory for his life and how he has lived up to this point. Thoughts? Would love to see this on the next Perligo Ponders. I think you raise a good question and a good point with the idea of how things look and how Tyler's dressed in Heavydirtysoul, and the possibility of that being a controlled dream that perhaps Clancy's having, or Tyler's having through the person of Clancy, or is Clancy within the dream, or that Nico's projecting onto Clancy. One thing, though, that I think is good to keep in mind is that in Heavydirtysoul, while the location and a lot of it does feel very different to what we see later, it is also filled with things that we then see later. The car, for instance, we keep seeing. The road we see in Jumpsuit. The bishop is seen, or a bishop is seen, in the front seat of the car. He is dressed more like the bishops on the submarine and Saturday, but he is dressed like a bishop. And then the way Clancy is dressed, it is true, is different to what we then see later when he becomes Clancy, or becomes a bandito. But it's not that different to what we see him wearing in Nico and the Niners. And so my theory is that that sort of style of outfit is what the citizens of Dema wear, sort of their uniform. So that's why we see him wearing that in Heavydirtysoul and Nico and the Niners. And then obviously at the end of Nico and the Niners going into Levitate, he is given bandito tape, and then he gets some other clothing to wear and stuff at the camp. But that's what the citizens wear. And then the other thing that we see in Nico and the Niners and in Paladin Straight are what those who are chosen as part of the Glorious Gone wear. And that's sort of a gray version of the same kind of outfit. That would be the main thing that I would say, is that there are some things that make the video seem different and a little off compared to some of the other ones, but there are also a lot of things that do ground it in what we see later, and it's not as wholly disconnected as it might seem at first glance. Although I do very much understand where you're coming from when you say that. But that doesn't necessarily rule out the idea of controlled dreaming. I mean, certainly that idea seems to play into what we see in City Walls, right? What is going on with those flashbacks to those other moments, especially because they're different to what we've seen before. What is Nico doing there to Tyler? Is he doing anything? Is the Torchbearer doing that? Is a past version of Clancy doing that? It's, who knows exactly, right? I think that's something we're just going to have to keep thinking on. But it could be controlled dreaming in a sense. The Clicky Equestrian has this to say. Perligo ponders, why did the Torchbearer bring 8 banditos with him to the tower if he knew the cycle and is trying to defeat it? Also, what do you think the Torchbearer rolled up in a scroll in the City Walls? Music video, maps, and letters, perhaps? There's a series of questions here. I should probably take them one at a time. So, first of all, why did the Torchbearer bring 3 banditos with him to the tower if he knew the cycle and is trying to break it? Or bring 8? Why did the Torchbearer bring 8 banditos up to the tower if he knew the cycle? I think it could be because he knew something about this cycle. He says in the Clancy tour, we have that message, which I can't remember if it was explicitly attributed to him or everyone just assumed it was from him, but if we defeat them, we will become them. And if we become them, we must do better. And so I think there's a sense in which he understands the only way to win is to defeat the bishops, and then you must become the bishops. And you must do so in a way that is better without becoming Nico or Blurryface. And so he brings the other banditos because you need the other 8 to join. And in fact, in the ultimate end of the cycle, there will be 10 bishops. The Torchbearer will take the cloak and become one of them. This is all pure conjecture, right? I may backtrack on this tomorrow, but he wants to complete the cycle and have there be 10 bishops, but they're good bishops, right? But then he gets to the tower and sees that, okay, that's not Clancy anymore. He's become Nico now. Right? He says that at the end when he goes to the bottom of the tower. He says that's not Clancy up there anymore. But in one version of the plan, perhaps that is, and that is still Clancy, even though he's defeated Nico. And even though he's becoming a bishop in a sense, or establishing a new rule in Dema. I could change my mind on that tomorrow. So it's an interesting question because it's hard to have a specific answer. What did the Torchbearer roll up in the scroll in the city walls, music, video, maps, and letters perhaps? That's what it looked like. I mean, his plans. I think we didn't get to see wholly everything included in there, but that's the basic idea. It's the Torchbearer's plan that gets referenced time and time again. Does the city walls confirm that the symbol... the logo, essentially, is heavily associated with the phrase entertain my faith? Perhaps, yeah. I mean, it seems to, right? That's definitely an implication. Based on the fact that it's turned him into a bishop, does this phrase and symbol now have a negative connotation? It might, if that's what happened, but I don't think that's what turned him into a bishop. I think being stabbed by the antlers, by the tools of seizing, turned him into a bishop. And it was at that point that he split, kind of leaving a copy of himself here to become Nico and a copy of himself to become Clancy starting the next cycle. So no, I don't think that has a negative connotation now, because that didn't turn him into a bishop. That wasn't an evil part of the power that he used, right? That was something else, destroying Nico, and then he is overtaken by Blurryface, essentially, or that side of him. Is Clancy, the new Nico, going to promote vialism and all those horrible things? That's something which I don't think I can give a clear answer on right now, because I think the answer seems to be yes, but what that means for him and for vialism, right? Again, like, this ending to the story does really change how we look at a lot of things. A lot of people thought it was going to happen, but I don't think a lot of people really understood the implications now that we are. I mean, my short answer is yes, it seems like that's what Clancy is going to do as Nico, not necessarily as Clancy. And I think really the best way to look at that is to see this whole thing as something, a dream or a vision or something that is populated really just by just by Tyler's subconscious. The Torchbearer may be kind of, well, he probably is too, like kind of a projection, but maybe he's not. Maybe he's an external force that's kind of guiding him through this dream. But if we consider that the banditos become bishops, and the bishops are all different insecurities of Tyler's, that means the banditos are pretty themselves intrinsically connected to Tyler as well, just like the bishops were. And so because of that, it seems like in a lot of ways, all of this is kind of, everything in Dema is part of Tyler. It's all part of his imagination, of a dream he's having, projections of his subconscious. And so instituting something like vialism by the kind of alter ego Blurryface side of him would essentially, and it does make it less dark, but it's still kind of dark and tragic. It seems to me that would be how Tyler struggles with things or kills off parts of himself that he finds to be joyful as a result of depression, right? So maybe he doesn't go out and attend an event that would have made him happy because of depression or something like that, right? So that's like sort of a metaphor for killing off these moments of joy. And that's what the like citizens of Dema and the people, as it were, the projections, are kind of good things that shouldn't be destroyed, but through vialism, through the struggle that he has, and through Blurryface that represents his insecurities and his struggles, they are. And so how his insecurities can destroy things within him in that sense. That I think is the best way to look at it, given this ending right now. Once again, if you'd like your comment or question to be featured in the next episode, which will probably not be in a month, but probably in like a week or two, given how many questions are still coming in, just comment something interesting. Flag it with Perligo Ponders if you'd like, but I don't just pull from comments that are flagged or tagged in that manner. I do also pull other things that I think are interesting or I think deserve or warrant, I suppose I should say, a longer discussion than can really be conducted in the comment section on YouTube.